Thank you very much. Move on to item number 11.
Item number 11, fiscal year 2017 recommended operating and capital budget.
All right, Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. My name is Bob Samario. I'm the finance director. And as you can see, you are receiving a copy of, fresh off the presses, the fiscal year 2017 recommended budget. So the purpose of the
Give us a chance to study this before.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the purpose of today is just to give you really an overview, a high-level overview of that budget document. We'll be looking at almost every fund, but in really high level. As you know, the details will come later. We'll have several meetings, probably 6 or so meetings where the departments will come and present their respective budgets to the City Council over a 1 to 3 hour work session. So that's when you'll get a lot of the details. You're free to ask questions today, but again, the intent is not to get into the details, and I may defer some of those questions to when those departments come before you later on in May. So just kind of as an introduction, the charter requires that the city administrator present to the City Council its recommended budget. It comes out of the city administrator's office. We do it a little earlier than the charter requires because it gives more time for you folks and, of course, the community to review the document. And then we also wanted to point out that this is the second year of a 2-year plan. So you may recall that we produced and you adopted back in June of 15 the 2-year plan, which contained the second year, 2017, of the budget, which we are now sort of looking at. So it's considered an addendum to that document. So you'll notice that it's a much smaller document than the 2-year plan. It's probably a third of the size. It doesn't have all the detailed information that the 2-year plan does. So if you look at the back, you're not going to see all the departmental programmatic information of the numbers, the dollars and the cents. You're really only going to see the performance measurement information in the back. The front section is the same. It's all summary information for all the funds and the citywide totals. So one of the reasons we do a 2-year plan is really to sort of look ahead more than just 1 year, but it's also so that we don't really make big changes every year. So our tradition has been that we typically in the second year of a 2-year plan, we don't look to make big programmatic changes, and so we're consistent with that approach. So programmatically, pretty much the same. We call it status quo, but it's continuation of the same levels of service for the most part. But I will point out that, and we'll talk more about this, on the general fund side, we have seen some big changes to revenues. And so in that regard, that has changed the numbers from what we saw a year ago in the 2-year plan. So I'm going to look at some citywide numbers and share those with you, and then look at the general fund, spend a bit of a time there. High level, of course, and then each of the enterprise funds, I'm just going to talk real briefly about them. I don't want to steal the thunder of departments when they come back and present their budgets, but I'll give you kind of a sense of how they're doing from a financial and budgetary perspective. And then I'll go through the proposed public review schedule. The purpose of the day is also to have you approve that proposed schedule, which is all the public hearings we have and work sessions where you're going to be hearing about the budget. So citywide, you can see at the bottom right that from an operating budget perspective, the total is $300 million. It grows seemingly every year. The biggest portion of that in terms of an individual fund is the general fund at the bottom right. It's $126.2 million, about 41% of the overall budget citywide. What's interesting is that the enterprise funds combined, all of them combined together, are about the same size as just the general fund by itself at $126.3 million. We do have other funds that are included within this document. The internal service funds in the top right at 8%. Those are the funds that account for services provided to other city operations. A good example is the motor pool. It's a central service that is providing services, vehicles, and maintenance across all departments. And then the bottom left, you'll see special revenue funds make up a fairly big category at 10%, $29.3 million. These are funds like the Creeks Fund, our Measure A or Transportation Sales Tax Fund, and the streets operations. All those funds are considered special revenue funds because the monies are restricted for a specific purpose. Looking at the capital program, the proportions change pretty dramatically. You can see the bottom right that 65% of the capital program citywide is for enterprise funds. They are a very capital intensive set of operations. And then the rest of the three other categories of funds, the general fund, special revenue, and internal service funds, are all about the same, interestingly, about almost $3 million each at about 11%. Our total capital program for next year is about $26 million. Looking at positions, this is a historical look at our positions since 1999. You'll see I skip a number of years from 99 to 2006, but you can see from 1999 through the peak in 2009 that we had position increases reaching 1,088, and this is again citywide. But then the Great Recession hit, and we saw a reduction in positions, primarily in the general fund, where we had the most impact, to a low point in 2013 of 998. Since then, we have been adding positions very incrementally and measuredly as revenues have increased, and in a way to try to restore services that were cut during the Great Recession. We're not all the way there. In fact, you can see that even next year at 1,029, we're well below where we were back in 2009 at 1,088. So turning our attention to the general fund, again, no significant changes to the operations or programs in relation to 2016 this year. But as for revenues, we have seen sales taxes and TLT revenues fall below our projections that we made last year for 2017. Fortunately, that was offset by property taxes. They are up a little bit. So overall, you may recall that when we put together the two-year financial plan in 17, we had a surplus that we anticipated of $1.2 million. Well, that's all gone. We don't have that anymore because of the revenue impacts. In fact, we were dealing with a slight deficit of about $660,000, which we had to balance to, which I'll talk about how we got there in a moment. But I do want to point out that even with that small deficit, overall the general fund is in really good financial shape. As you know, last year we did finally get to a fully funded reserve status, first time in 10 years. So, regardless of what happens in the near future, we have a recession in the next couple, 3 years, we are well positioned to respond to that because those reserves are designed, at least a portion of those are designed to respond to those kinds of economic downturns. But generally speaking, I would say that the outlook is a little more murky. We're just starting to see things, wane a little bit in terms of revenue growth, not just in the general fund, but other funds. So we're just kind of keeping an eye on that. We're optimistic, but we're a little cautious as well. So this is what we call the sources and uses of funds. This is a consolidation of the first summary schedule you'll see in the document. And it shows where the money comes from in the general fund and where it's spent. And I wanted just to spend a moment on this because I wanted to talk about it vertically. It's what the original plan provided for and how that's changed across to where we're getting to the recommended budget. So the capital reserves, we oftentimes will use reserves, not the operating reserves, but capital reserves to fund our capital program. And the original plan called for $300,000 of those capital reserves. That was money that was accumulated in community development. It's for the permit tracking system. They add a surcharge to building permits to accumulate money to replace that system when due. It's coming due next year, so they had planned for that. You can see across that we're adding $1.7 million to that capital reserve from other sources, and I'll get into that in more detail later. But for now, we are going to be using about $2 million in capital reserves for capital to fund most of that capital program. Our operating revenues, where we had a big impact, as I mentioned, you'll see that they went down $1.5 million on a net basis, primarily because of bed tax and sales tax. On the operating budget side, very little change from the original plan. It's just a coincidence. We've had some ups and downs, but on a net basis, it was only a $5,200 decline. The capital program, we were able to add to that. We'll talk more about that, but essentially the surplus from 15 added to that primarily. But the important part is that at the bottom, we had a surplus in the two-year plan of $1,159,000. That all went away because of the revenue losses. And so we still have a balanced budget, but we no longer have that surplus we can count on.
I have a question. So, okay, last year we had a surplus in budget policy reserves called for half of that to go to capital for this year. Is that this number or what number? Where is that number?
I'll get into that in a little bit.
Get into that. Okay,
Yes.
if you can incorporate that in your comments, thanks.
So how we balanced the $666,000 I mentioned. So we did reduce the money that we otherwise would have committed toward capital by $356,000. So that was one measure of how we balanced that $660,000 deficit. Overall, we always reshuffle the deck. We kind of look at the capital projects that were in the original plan. We look at what the priorities have been and what have they changed. We look at other funding sources. But in the whole, the money we had allocated went down by $356,000. So we didn't necessarily pick out one or two. It was just a total reshuffling of the deck in a sense. We also are planning to implement we're calling a hiring slowdown. So what this means is that whenever we have a vacancy in the general fund, and it's going to exclude public safety for obvious reasons, that the city administrator is going to have to approve the filling of those positions. And in some cases, he's going to say no, or he might say, let's wait a couple months, with the idea is to try to generate a little more savings than we typically would get from normal turnover in staff. And we are targeting of $300,000 in savings by that sort of action, if you will. So where we're going to see that $300,000 is in our anticipated year-end variance. That's the number we budget as a revenue, and it represents what we believe we're going to generate in savings every year from expenditure savings through salaries, turnover, and staff. So this hiring slowdown is we believe, going to generate an additional $300,000. So we bumped that up to $2.3 million from $2 million that was in the original plan. Does that all make sense? Sort of?
Yeah, what services are going to be affected, do we know?
So we've not changed the services, but this was just sort of balancing through the percent of services will be a reduction of how much money we devoted to capital. But this is really just going to be slowing down the hiring process, but no changes to services.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to make sure I get so we have a policy of last year's surplus, half of it goes into to reserves. The other half we're going to spend on capital capital issues.
Right.
And last year that was 600 and something thousand. What? No, 1.2 million. What was the number?
So in 15, we generated about $3.5 million in a surplus. And again, I'll get into that, but I'll answer it right now. And we decided that instead of 50%, we wanted to only allocate 25% to capital.
Right.
So that's the $861,000 you'll see in a moment that added to our capital program for next year. The balance went to reserves that helped us close the gap and get to a fully funded status reserve.
That's what we did last year.
Right.
Okay. And so what were we supposed to, if everything was where it was supposed
Right.
to be?
So
this year?
for this year, we had a budgeted surplus in 16, and then for 17 as well. And so at the end of the year, we're going to go through the same process. We still have the direction from council that this year and for 17, to the extent we have a surplus, not budgeted amount, just above and beyond what the revenues are that are budgeted, we're going to allocate only 25% to capital unless we find that we continue to be fully funded in our reserves. So we're going to wait and see. But if see ourselves falling short again this year or next year in reserves, even though we're fully funded as of last year, we're going to follow the direction of allocating only 25% of any surplus to capital and the remainder to the operating reserves.
My memory was the council decided, and for good reasons, to change the policy for 50-50
Right.
in order to have fully fund reserves over 2 years. We did that in half the time. But I don't remember that being an ongoing policy. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, we're using the same process this year as we did last year, which is not 50-50, it's 75-25.
So, yeah, Madam Mayor, so the direction specifically was actually 3 years, 15, 16, and 17, only allocate 25% of the surplus to capital, 75% to reserves to help fully fund our reserves. And we thought it would take us to the end of 2017 to get there.
Okay, so I guess the difference in your interpretation and mine was we did that in order to fully fund reserves. So
Right.
Since we fully fund reserves sooner,
Right.
then we're, okay.
We'll
And
have
I
to
know we'll go through this
we'll
as we go through the
reevaluate
budget,
16
but
right. Yeah, since
Okay.
we already got there, we'll just sort of reevaluate 16 and 17 in
Got it.
terms of how we do better than the budget.
okay. All right, competing priorities.
I know
get
it's
it.
confusing.
Mr. Dominguez, you also had a question?
I just want to make a notation here so I don't forget when I go back to look at this. So deficit of 660,509. So that's on the upcoming year budget?
Yes, that was what we were looking at. It's balanced now, but when we were putting this together, we were left with that kind of a deficit that we've now
Okay,
resolved.
so you had to reduce
Capital.
either spending by that amount or increase revenue or some combination. So the 355 was by reducing the spending
Capital, that's correct.
capital, and then another 300 from salary savings,
Right.
and then the increased anticipated year-end variance by $2 million. So I'm not sure I understand what the variance is. So that's just the reserve that you had built in.
Yeah, so Madam Mayor, Councilmember Dominguez, the $2 million was already in the budget. That was the amount we estimated we would save on the expenditures side from just normal turnover in staff. We believe now that we can bump that up by $300,000 to $2.3 million because of this hiring slowdown that we're going to implement next year.
Okay. And they reduced appropriate reserves by 4,000.
That was just to balance the difference.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So let's take a look at revenues. This is a pie chart you've all seen many, many times, but it's always good to refresh our memories that our budget is primarily funded from taxes. You can see that of $127 million, 66% is coming from taxes, very typical of a general fund for a city. The rest of the revenues are sort of parsed out amongst a bunch of little ones. Interfund charges at the top is the second largest. Interestingly, those are charges that the general fund imposes on other departments and other funds, like enterprise funds for services that we provide. Good example is the overhead. All of the finance staff, all the city administrator's office, and mayor and council, in fact, all of those administrative functions reside in the general fund, but provide services to enterprise funds as well as the special revenue funds. We charge them for those services, and in fact, we recover on average about half of our costs that we incur in the general fund for administration we recover that from enterprise funds and special revenue funds. So we account for that in the interfund charge category. To the left of that, you see fees and charges, and I mentioned this before that since I've been here for the last 20 years, that number has been about 9%, 10%, which means two things. It's not a big number. It's a small portion of our overall revenues. Largely, things that we provide out of the general fund are subsidized from taxes. But it also means that we've been doing a pretty good job keeping up with the fees, making sure that we're keeping up with the cost to provide those services, whether it be recreation services, planning, building, and those kinds of things. And then you can see at the top right, the anticipated year-end variances or revenue amount. So this slide, in a real sort of summary fashion, shows you the major changes to our top 5 general fund revenues. Our biggest revenue is property taxes at almost $30 million. The original budget estimated 29.9, and it also assumed that we would grow 5% for next year. We've done better than that this year. We also assumed we were going to grow about 5% this year, but we're expecting to grow 6% in 16. So that raised the base. So we're still essentially assuming a 5% growth for this next year, but because the base went up this year, we're going to be able to add almost $1 million to that revenue number. Sales taxes goes the other way. You can see that we assumed a year ago for 2017 that we would have a growth of 4.5% in sales taxes for next year. We assumed the same thing this year. And as you'll see, we didn't come close to that. We don't expect to come close to that this year. And we are expecting next year that to be more of a 3% growth. So that overall impact of this year's impact and then the reduced growth next year from 4.5 to 3 is going to require us to lower the estimates by $1.6 million. Our bed taxes, same story, not doing as well as we thought this year. Not expecting the 6% growth next year, and so that has an impact of almost $1.3 million. And you can see some of the impacts on the other revenues. So overall, we had to lower our estimates from what was in the original 2-year plan for next year by almost $2.5 million. And I just wanted to show you how we kind of developed these, and I'm not going to go through all of them, just sales taxes and bed taxes because they're important, and they're the ones we've seen the decline. So some context, 2012, sales taxes grew almost 9%. In 2013, they grew by about 3.5%. Last year, 6%. So when we were developing the 2-year plan for 16 and 17, we had that context. And then in addition, we saw that in the first quarter of last year, we had almost a 7% growth. So that was, by the way, we got that information in December. So we're well into developing 16 and 17 revenue estimates that we thought we're going to be conservative and assume a 4.5% growth for 16 and 17. That was the basis upon which we developed those. But you can...
Could I ask,
Sure.
and we are assuming that drop, percentage drop, as it were, is from internet sales?
It could be a number of factors. CPI has been low. That's one factor. You know, the CPI has been, almost at some point 0% or 1%. So that drives prices, and if prices go up or don't go up, that's going to affect sales taxes. We think broadly and overall, internet sales are having an impact on our sales taxes. And we know that in prior years, we've had really good growth from car sales. We're not expecting that in the near future.
Say car sales?
Car sales.
Auto sales, yeah.
So there's a lot of interplay here. So I really couldn't give you a good answer other than, the whole sales tax structure is changing to some extent, and we know that CPI isn't as high as we've seen in the past. And I think that's all those are coming together to reduce our revenue growth.
Does this reflect what I want to say, not shrinking of our economy, but
It absolutely does.
Plateau.
What it suggests is that we're moving more to our service industry versus a production and sale of goods and commodities. So as we shift to a more service-oriented industry in the state, then we're going to really be losing sales tax dollars.
So then you lose sales tax.
Yep.
That's what you're saying. Okay.
So I just wanted to point out that since the 6.9% growth, we've had 2.5, 0.3. We essentially have not had really good growth. Last quarter we just recently got was 2.1. It was good to get that in light of the 0.3% decline the prior quarter. So this year we're only expecting less than a 1% growth, and then next year 3%. It was 4.5% in both years, but 3% we think is reasonable. CPI is starting to creep up again, so we think that prices will naturally go up on goods, and therefore sales taxes go up. And we're just trying to be a little optimistic. 2% is arguably a good number to go with, but we kept it at 3%, thinking that we're going to see more growth. And then bed taxes, the same story. You could see that even though we assume 6% this year and next year, other than a 6% in July, we really had some really poor months here all the way through February. We just got the March number in, and we're seeing a growth of just 3.3%. Again, that's compared to a 6% growth we assume for the year. We're assuming that by the end of the year, we're going to get to 1.7%, well below the 6%, and then next year we'd be at 4.7%. I do want to point out that this year we had factored in what we call a wet weather adjustment. With all the El Nino and all that, we thought we would see some impacts. It may not be at 71,000, but there was some rain and some impact. Next year, two things. We are looking to phase out, as you know, we're going to be phasing out the TOT from vacation rental based on stepped-up enforcement. We're getting $1.2 million today, maybe a little less now. So we think we have to plan for that from a budgetary perspective, and we've factored out a portion of that for next year. And if you look at the overall growth, it's almost 6% next year, and it's not because we think it's going to grow 6%. It's because we expect to see the Santa Barbara Inn come back online coming July, and that's really what's providing us that growth, not real growth in rates or occupancies. On the expenditure side, again, the $126 million budget. Most of that is for public safety, fire, and police. They're over half of the budget, very common, very typical. About 14% is administration, and I mentioned that really the impact on administration is half of that because half of it is recovered through the overhead. Parks and Recreation on the bottom or left is the second largest department behind public safety at 14%, and then community development in the top right. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details other than to show you by department what the originally proposed budget provided for each department and how that has changed in terms of what we're recommending today, and what position changes are being added by department. So this is not comparing 2016 to 17. This is comparing what was in the original two-year plan for 17 to what we're now recommending. And you'll see that for the most part, there have been very little changes in relation to what we originally proposed. I do want to point out some of the bigger changes. In community development in particular, you'll see that their budget is growing by about $600,000, and you can see there are 5 positions being proposed. Almost all of that is in response to just increased development and building activity. The workload is tremendous, and all those positions and the dollars are funded from increased revenues in that department, because with more activity comes more revenues, building permits, planning fees, and the like. One of those positions was added in 2016, and that was for stepped-up vacation and rental enforcement. But for the most part, it's in response to increased activities. In the police department, I don't want to scare you. The budget has gone down relative to what we originally proposed, and this is just because of turnover. You know that they've had a lot of vacancies, and typically when somebody leaves through retirement particularly, they're at the top of the range. And so when those positions are filled or left vacant, like in some cases, they're budgeted at the lower step or brought in at a lower step. So just that change from when we originally forecast a year and a half ago has resulted in budgeted savings of $400,000. It's all it is, just a budgetary estimate. In Public Works, you'll see that their budget also is going down by $254, and this is not because of reforecasting. It's because they are proposing to remove some positions out of the general fund. In the engineering division, they're removing 3 positions in the survey crew positions just because the workload is not there. Those positions are either leaving or retiring by the end of this year, so they'll be vacant. And then they're also going to bring in 1 position into engineering from Measure A. The work isn't there to support the position in the Measure A, so they're bringing them back into the general fund where the work is really being performed. So the net of that is a reduction of 2 positions.
I'm sorry, Mr. Samario, did you say that was in the survey department?
Yeah, in the engineering survey crew.
Interesting, thank you.
In Parks and Recreation, all of this is attributable to the fact that we're bringing in those maintenance folks from the Golf Fund into the Parks Division of Parks and Recreation. And so that's the 6.8 FTEs. And then you can see their budget goes up as well. And their budget goes up because we wanted to bring in the impact of bringing those positions into the general fund. And incidentally, we'll talk about this more in a moment, that additional cost is being paid for by the Gulf Fund. So they're going to be transferring about that much, a little bit more than that, to offset the impact of bringing in those positions in the first year. And then lastly, in general government, this is essentially where we had our appropriated reserves for the budget surplus, so that went away. What's left now is really debt service and capital and those kinds of things. Okay, so trying to respond to some of the questions you mentioned, Madam Mayor. So this is how the capital program is being funded overall. So on the bottom right, or all the way to the right, we're looking at funding $3 million, $3.1 million for capital. And so how it's going to be paid for is general fund revenues, the first row. The original plan, we planned on using $1.3 million just about from revenues to pay for capital. And I wanted to just quickly give you some historical context. In the old days, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we had reserves above policy and we could afford to be a little more conservative with our revenue estimates, we had reserves. We had enough reserves to pay for a capital program. So every year we budgeted reserves for capital. But then our reserves went down. We had to be a little more or less conservative with our revenue estimates. So now we are in a tradition or mode of funding our capital program from revenues. We don't have the luxury of reserves above policy to fund capital. So it's got to be paid for from revenues. And so every year we devote some money. This in the original plan it was 1.3. We lowered it to help balance. So we're still putting $1.1 million from revenues to cover capital. We also have $75,000 from a closed-out project in this year that we're going to fall to reserves that we'll reprogram for next year. And then the $1,083,000, this is what I sort of mentioned. There are two revenues that we accumulate in the general fund that are designated for a specific purpose. One is the permit fees, where we charge folks additional money. It's a surcharge so that we can accumulate money to replace technology when it's coming due. And we have accumulated about $600,000 or so toward replacing the permit tracking system. That's the Tidemark system, and that'll be replaced next year. So we have money to do so. It's not coming from reserves or any other sources. So it's kind of great that we accumulated that money. We also have money we collect from the PEG fees on our cable bills that is restricted for capital, and it goes to the City TV program, and they're going to be using somewhere close to $500,000 to replace all their equipment to go from analog to digital and HD equipment. So that's money that they collected through the Cox bills. And then lastly is the capital surplus from 15, or the surplus from 15. That's 25% of the surplus that we had in 2015 versus 50 per City Council direction. And that's what allowed us to get fully funded in reserves, because the other 3/4 went to our reserves, our regular reserves that got us to fully funded status. And how it's presented in the budget document is the operating budget includes $166,000. So if you look at the capital column in the summary schedule, you'll see $2.9 million capital, but the other $166 is buried in the operating budget, but it is still for capital. And I'm not going to go through this list, but there is the list of all the capital programs that we're proposing. You can see the first four make up over $1 million that just relate to parks and facilities. So that's we've been continuing the theme of putting money where we think it's more where the priorities are. So can't really present a budget without talking about infrastructure. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing for the benefit of the public, what we're doing in responding to the infrastructure challenge. So background, the city owns assets overvalued at over $1 billion. That's probably a conservative number. As you know, many of those assets are in enterprise funds, water mains, sewer mains, and all those things. And fortunately, we have rates to be able to cover those. Yes?
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dominguez.
Yeah.
The general fund capital by source. So the original plan was 1.6 million, and then we're up to 3 million.
Correct.
So does that mean we're spending more? This is just the revenue source?
Absolutely. We're almost doubling the amount of money toward capital. And a lot of it is because we've had the surplus from 15 that we can add to that. And we do that every year. And then we also have those restricted revenues that we've been accumulating for the permit tracking system and for City TV.
So these are restricted to capital anyways?
Yes, they are.
Because it sounded like at the beginning our revenue estimates have dropped. So that's why it just struck me as odd that we would be increasing this.
Right.
But if they're restricted funds, then I can understand that. Thank you.
Sure. Good question. So as I mentioned, a lot of the capitals or the assets are in the enterprise funds, and we are fortunate that within reason we can adjust rates to cover our operating and capital needs. We also have some voter-approved measures that help fund some of our programs. As you know, the Streets Fund has dedicated restricted revenues from Measure A, utility users taxes and gas tax, and same with the creeks under Measure B. And we also receive a number of grants. But a large portion of our capital infrastructure does not have any either adequate or dedicated resources. And here are some examples. And I put up streets, even though they have some revenues, but it's far from being adequate. As you know, we're in the $7 million range of short of what we really need every year. And this is an estimate we developed about a year and a half ago that $400 million is the unfunded liability for infrastructure over the next 20 years. So in February, the council directed staff to work with the finance committee, and what we're doing is discussing options for how we maximize the investment in city's infrastructure with a focus on the streets operations. So the finance committee has been delving into the details of the streets operations. What are we paying for? What are we doing? What are some of the core things that we're doing and non-core services that don't relate to pavement management or improvement? So we've had a number of meetings. We think it's going well, but it's a tedious process as we get into the details of that. We expect that we'll have some recommendations from that finance committee coming out in the summer. So quickly, I'll go through the enterprise funds again, just starting with how they've changed from the original two-year plan. And you can see that for the most part that they have not changed that dramatically. I will point out that the golf fund, you can see, has gone up by $784,000. And I don't want anybody to be confused. The golf fund, when moving toward a new contract, they are going to be taking on more responsibilities in the golf course, and I'll get to that in a moment. But so their costs are going up because they're doing more, but so are the revenues. So on a net basis, they're going to do it better than what they have been doing in the past. And then that also includes the fact that they're going to be paying about $350,000 to the general fund to cover the impacts of moving the maintenance staff into the general fund. So that's half of the 784 growth.
Are these revenues or costs or budget?
Yes. And
All three?
They're all estimates, sure.
Okay.
In the solid waste fund, two things for the $500,000 increase. One, the CPI that we factor in every year is coming in higher than we anticipated. So it's half of that. The other half is the fact that we are now having to pay to process our recyclables versus getting monies. The commodity values have dropped so much that rather than budgeting a revenue, we're actually not going to be able to budget revenues and having to pay in order to continue that program, because it's an important program to continue to recycle our materials. We hope that the revenues come back because commodity prices tend to go up and down. In the water fund, you see the biggest increase of $5 million. This is just better and more accurate numbers with respect to the desal cost impacts for both operations and financing, and also we're budgeting money for purchase of water. Again, all better numbers, all just adding to $5 million in terms of the change for next year. So going through each one sort of briefly, the airport fund, you've seen this before. You remember that they've had challenges with the reduction in air services into Santa Barbara Airport. They had American Eagle leave back in 2014, and then immediately thereafter, about a year later, less than a year, Frontier left. The airport implemented a number of cost-cutting measures to their credit to really sort of rebalance for the most part, but we were still left with $600,000 ongoing deficit. You may recall that they were expecting to have to use reserves over the next 3 years, starting this year and next 2 years, to address those shortfalls. Well, some good news that two favorable developments have emerged just recently. One, as you've heard, American Airlines is going to begin providing services to Dallas-Fort Worth on June 2nd. That's going to generate an additional $306,000 next year, and then it'll go up to $406,000 in 2018 because they provided a landing fee waiver in the first year to sort of help attract them. We're also anticipating that the new dealership will be online in 2018 over there on the corner of north of Hollister and La Patera. It'll be a Chrysler Jeep dealership we're expecting, and that will bring in an estimated $324,000 per year. So we're getting close, and we think that, or at least the airport believes that with some managing the capital and with some expected additional savings from vacant positions, that they won't have to use much of the reserves over the next 3 years. And then, of course, starting in 2019, new things emerge that will help resolve their structural deficits. So I talked about the Gulf Fund. So the contract is going to be effective July 1 with Corsco, and again mentioned that it is going to be expanding the scope of the city's operations or responsibilities. So in addition to the maintenance of the golf course, we are now going to be running the pro shop, all the merchandising that goes along with that, handling all the lessons, the carts, and the golf ranges. So more cost because we're doing more, but more revenues to offset and more than offset those increased costs. And the purpose of the approach was to address the structural deficit they were facing, the reserves had been going down, and then hopefully at some point to be able to accumulate reserves to do some improvements to the facilities. The golf course has responsibility for the facilities out there, and at some point they're going to need to be renovated or improved or replaced. So I mentioned all the staff will be shifted to the Parks Division. Some are already announced their retirement before July 1. With the folks that do end up shifting over will provide some added one-time resources to address backlog of projects. But the impact of the general fund is estimated at $343, and the golf fund will accordingly be transferring, and we budgeted for this, transferring $343,000 to the general fund to offset that impact. In the first year, we think that beyond that, the impacts will be pretty nominal. Downtown Parking Fund, in really good shape. You can see the breakdown of their revenues. The largest revenue source comes from the bread and butter, the hourly parking, beyond the 75-minute free period. Other parking fees make up about $1.3 million at 16%, and then other revenues as well. And as I mentioned before, they are driven by the economy, and we've had a strong economy, particularly in the last several years. Although their revenues are starting to stabilize. I mentioned this at the beginning, even though we're not just sales tax and the bed tax, but we're seeing this as well in downtown parking. But still, they have reserves that are healthy. I think they have double the reserves that the policy says they should have, which is great. But keep in mind, they no longer have the redevelopment agency to help them and pay for some major improvements to the structures. So long term, having more reserves than what the policy says, you might want to consider a new reserve for them to help address, which is really going to come to eventually, is to major improvements and major replacements down the road of the structures and lots.
Bob, can I ask a question about the golf fund?
Sure.
The expected budgetary impact is approximately $343.
Yes.
Did you say the golf fund will cover that the first year?
In the first year, yes.
And will it stay the same, or is it expected to?
Yeah, we expect that to be dropping dramatically again. We're expecting some retirements at the end of this year and more retirements next year. And so we think that on an ongoing basis that the impact's going to be pretty nominal. But we'll be tracking that.
When it says expected budgetary impact, it'll actually be neutral. There's no impact because the enterprise fund? Okay.
True. Absolutely true. Sure. Solid Waste Fund, stable revenues. We expect at the end of this year to have reserves fully funded, which is great, because once upon a time they weren't an enterprise fund. So when we transitioned them over, we said, well, you're subject to the same policy requirements, reserve requirements. So they're going to get there by the end of this year. Some nominal rate increases for the collection services provided by Marburg, as well as disposal services provided by the county at Tahiguas. We talked about the commercial diversion program, AB 3041. I do want to mention that in next week, we're going to be here at Council. Matt Four, our Environmental Services Manager, will be talking about where we're at with the implementation of the single-use bag ordinance. And as you know, we're working pretty hard and heavy on the Resource Recovery Project, and we'll be providing you a status report this May or June. In the Water Fund, you've heard a lot about that, a lot of work on the drought response and securing supplies. And not to steal anybody's thunder, but I understand they were able to secure about 4,000 acre-feet of water very cheaply just recently, so that's good news. Some highlights for next year. The desal plant will be online, so the budget's going to reflect that. We are going to continue funding the main replacement program this next year at almost $5 million. The revenue requirements to address the increased costs and the revenue shortfalls from the increased conservation at 21% will be needed, and we are going to be proposing using $5 million in reserves, and those will be policy reserves to help reduce the impact of those rate increases. In the wastewater fund, there too are being impacted by the conservation, although they do have some savings this year that they expect will offset those revenue losses. The reserves are in pretty decent shape. They're expected at the end of this year to be $2 million above policy, and so it causes them and us to reevaluate whether we should be moving forward with a 5.5% increase to wastewater rates in light of what we're doing in the water side. So when they present their budget, they'll be asking that question of council, I'm sure. The Waterfront Fund, another one of our healthy funds, their total budget is $15.5 million. Most of it comes from commercial food leases for food and other types of leases. 28% from slip rentals, and then parking fees makes up 17%. As I mentioned before, the economy is a factor, but it's really weather. When it's warm and dry and outside, people just flock to the beaches and they do well. When it rains, even if the economy is strong, they're going to be impacted. They do have strong reserve balances as well because of the recession, since the strong recovery of the recession, and it's helping them to fund a robust capital and maintenance improvement program.
This accounts, that last slide accounts for 75% of the water fund.
Yeah, the rest comes from other smaller revenues like slip transfer fees and those kinds of things.
Slip what?
Slip transfer fees.
Transfer fees, okay.
Yeah. But as I mentioned, they are starting to see some slowdown. So they're not seeing the kind of growth they've seen in the past in commercial leases and food serving leases. The good news is parking is up, except for the harbor or the wharf where we have all the construction going on. 17's budget is largely unchanged and conservative because at some point we may get some rain, and they're always a little conservative and worried about that. So this is the review schedule. We have, I think, 6 or 7 meetings scheduled where departments will be presenting their budgets. The first one is on May 4th. You'll see most of the administrative departments will be here talking about their budgets. And then on May 9th, the city attorney along with community development and library. On May 11th, and note that these are not on the normal Tuesday meeting dates. These are special meetings that are dedicated just for the budget. So Wednesday, May 11th, we'll have the airport, waterfront, and solid waste funds. On the May 16th, Parks and Recreation, which will include the Golf Fund and the Creeks Restoration Fund. And then on Monday the 23rd, Public Works, large department, so one meeting dedicated just to them. On Thursday, the May 26th, Fire and Police, all public safety. And then the first will be the beginning of the deliberations with council. So this will be the opportunity for council to give us some direction based on what they've heard in the previous 6 or so work sessions. And then we'll have one more meeting on the 13th to give us final directions based on all the decisions that have been made. And we expect to adopt on the 21st. And the last thing I will say is that we are going to also be meeting with the Finance Committee as we do every year. They look at the budget differently, other topics in a little more detail. And so we'll be, of course, having those meetings, and we'll be adding any topics they wish to discuss. Oftentimes the committee wants to talk more about a little bit more about other topics than what we typically do. So we'll be doing that as well.
I'm sorry. So there's a number of outside requests for funding.
Yes.
Where does that fit?
So we will,
on the first?
as we did last year, we will be bringing those to the Finance Committee for discussion and recommendation to the full council, and then we'll bring those to you on the 1st of June.
1st of June?
Yep.
Okay. So then we can deliberate with those in mind. Great. Thank you.
And just so you can, where to find the budget, we actually have flash drives. Instead of, we used to use CD-ROMs, we now have these little flash drives so that somebody can come to the finance department, not have to get a big budget document. They can get a flash drive, plug it in, and look at it that way. They can always go to our website and look at it there. It's already there. And then we have hard copies at the main and east side branches of our library. And I just want to close by thanking really a lot of people, everybody, a lot of people are involved in putting this together. It's a major, major effort every year. Departmental budget staff as well. They have budgets folks in each department who work really hard to produce their own budget. I also want to mention specific individuals. Kate Wan in the city administrator's office works really hard and helps with putting this together, particularly on the P3 side. And then in finance, Michael Pease, our budget manager, he's the quarterback of all of this, and his assistant, Jonathan Abad. Julie Nemes, our treasury manager, Jennifer Tomaszewski, Diego Martin, and Jennifer Dixon all help putting this together. And it's, again, a lot of work. And I'm always amazed it comes together in time, but it always does. And I just wanted to give them recognition. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I don't see any speaker slips on this. Okay, so it's to the council for questions and any comments. Ms. Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So going back to the last slide of the airport fund, you mentioned balance of deficit will be closed with capital reductions and expected salary savings. Can you describe more about the salary savings?
Sure. Madam Mayor, Councilmember Murillo, They have a number of vacancies, particularly in the patrol area. They're dealing with the same issues that Harbor Patrol folks are dealing with, and police, and trying to find candidates to fill those positions. So they've had a number of vacancies. They expect that they're going to generate somewhere close to $600,000 from savings of just vacancies this year. But they do assume they're going to start filling those. But they don't expect they're going to be able to fill them all by next year necessarily. So they expect that they will have some more salary savings next year to help offset the deficit.
Okay, well, I'll ask more about that. And then on the golf fund, so this is the second slide of the golf fund. I understand there's 3 overhires in that transition from city staff to contractor staff. How does that affect the budget, that we have 3 overhires? People who didn't retire, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you can jump in on that one. Sorry.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Rio, I think you're talking about the staff that they're going to transfer over to the Parks and Recreation Department, especially into the Parks Department, that they're not going to lose their jobs. We're going to absorb them as overhires in the Parks Department. That's the amount that we expect the impact to be, approximately $343,000, that the golf fund will compensate the general fund for during that first year. And then, as Councilmember Dominguez asked, we feel over retirements, people leaving the organization, that we'll be able to fully absorb those most likely over a 1-year period of time, that we think the ongoing cost after that first year will be minimal.
Okay. I think that was part of the accounting that I did not appreciate with this change in the staff at the golf course. And I've set up a meeting with Mr. Samario for next week so that I can gauge really if we're saving money by the changeover at the golf course. And I would have more questions had I got this book even an hour before the meeting started. So thank you.
Madam Mayor and council members, I'll just say putting a budget document like this together takes a lot of staff time and work, and staff have been working on it up until just the last hour. And so we apologize you didn't get it sooner. We do have 6 to 7 hearings department by department. You're going to be working on this over a 2-month period of time, so I apologize you didn't have more time ahead of this, but this was more a presentation and not really a deliberative meeting that we were expecting.
I think the details of the budget we'll have for the hearing, so that way everyone who wants to comment on certain departments, now everyone gets it at the same time, and that's what the budget hearings are for. So I'm sure we'll go through with a fine-tooth comb all the different items.
Madam Mayor, I appreciate that. It's just that we've had this presentation, and I could have made some correlation with which was in the book, but I'll do that in the future. Thank you.
Right. Okay, Mr. White.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Samario thanked his staff, and I just want to thank Mr. Samario and Mr. Casey for pulling this together this year. The thanks belong to you too as well.
Okay, we do need a motion for accepting the recommended budget, to hear the report and the schedule of public review meetings. Moved by Dominguez, second by
Second.
by Hart. Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Madam Mayor, I'm just going to say no because I didn't get to look at the book. Thanks.
All this is receiving the budget document and saying yes or no to the public hearings. That's all we're voting on.
Okay.
But, okay. You can vote either way. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you. All right, item number 12.
Waterfront Hotel Development Agreement and Amendment to Chapter 28.95 of the Zoning Ordinance, recommending that Council introduce and subsequently adopt by a reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara